So when we get here to page 152, this section begins asking, how do infants organize their world? Does it depend on language? Or before they have language, do they organize the world differently than they do later when they have a more established language? So in order to answer these kinds of questions, we have to see how infants organize their world before they have language, when they're as young as 3 to 4 months old. And we find, when we get over to page 155, that there are different levels of categories. And these are really abstract. They're difficult to define because it's very intuitive for us. We, as adults, generally talk about things at the basic level category. So, for instance, if we were to use the word dog to refer to a dog, that's a basic level category. A superordinate category would be animal. A subordinate category would be Dalmatian. So if you imagine this in the shape of a hierarchy, you've got more specific at the bottom and less specific at the top. So you might say, okay, we've got a group of animals, and then if we break down types of animals, we might have, for instance, dogs and cats and cows and ducks and whatever. And then underneath each type of those, we might have a specific breed or a specific species. And we might say that that among dogs we have Dalmatians and Border Collies and Terriers, and we would separate it up, becoming more and more specific as we get down the hierarchy tree. But where we call a basic level category, that's just intuition for us. The definition that you see in the book is just this favored mid-level category that strikes some balance among members of the category. It's impossible to point your finger at it and say the reason why this is a basic level category is because X, Y, Z. Nobody knows what makes a basic level category. It just feels right to us. It's just what we talk about. So the question is, do infants recognize basic level categories the same way we do? Or when they're trying to learn a new word, do they assume that we're talking on the level of superordinate categories or subordinate categories? Here's an example. When we point to a dog and we say the word dog, does the infant assume that that's a basic level category, that if they see we've pointed at a Dalmatian, right? We've pointed at a Dalmatian, but we say dog. Does that child assume that only white dogs spotted with black dots are called dog? Or does he assume that all four-legged, happy household creatures with wagging tails and panting breath are dog? Or does he assume that all animals, all four-legged creatures out there in the world that have fur are dog, or all animals that have any number of legs and any kind of covering on their body are all of those dog? What does the infant assume? Some experiments have been done to be able to get a feel for this. One of those experiments is described here on page, it looks like 158. In the last paragraph, you see that some experimenters showed some things at a superordinate category level, like an animal, another kind of animal, another kind of animal, another kind of animal, and then a truck. If each one of the animals was called the same thing, then the infant showed interest in the truck more than he did in the animals. That is to say, if I showed the infant a cow and I said, Toma, and then I showed the infant a cat and I said, Toma, and then I showed the infant a tiger and said, Toma, then the infant assumes that this new word Toma must mean all kinds of animals, maybe all kinds of mammals, something like that. But when you show the infant a truck, then the infant will look longer at that truck because it knows this is not the same thing that I've been seeing. This is a new category. I expect that this adult person, is going to say a different word. Of course, the researchers don't say any word at all because they're not interested in whether the infant can learn a new word. We know the infant can learn a new word. We're interested in knowing, does the infant see animals as different from trucks? But the interesting thing is, when the experimenters call each animal a different thing, if they show the animal, if they show a cow and they say Toma, and they show a cat and they say Tilly, and they show a tiger and they say Neem, and they show a bear and they say Bin, then they show a truck. Interestingly, the infants do not show any more interest in the truck than they showed in each animal individually. And that is to suggest that infants are recognizing each one of these things is being described at a subordinate level. I'm being given a specific name for each one of these things, and it recognizes that the truck may or may not belong to this superordinate category. That's not what's important. It is its own subordinate thing. Now, that's... I don't know how else to describe that. It's difficult to wrap your minds around because it's so intuitive. We just have these categories, these superordinate, basic, and subordinate levels of categories in our minds. We just assume them, but infants, not necessarily. They don't necessarily assume the same. But infants do have some built-in biases that help them to learn language. One of these biases is described on page 152. It's the whole object bias. That is, that the infants assume that when they hear a new word, that new word is referring not to the legs of the object, not to the color of the object, but to the whole object. If I show a rabbit to the infant and I say rabbit, the infant will have a bias built in that it will assume the word rabbit means this whole object. If I want to teach the infant the word leg, I have to teach it in a different way. I can't show the rabbit and say leg, or the infant will assume that this whole object that I'm showing to the infant is the word leg, that leg refers to the rabbit. So that's one of the biases that helps. And the interesting thing is, it's an adaptive strategy, because adult humans often use the same bias. We often assume that if we're going to teach a new word to somebody, that we have to refer to the whole object and not just to its parts. It's maladaptive in only a few instances. For instance, on page 154, you see that there's one kid described by a researcher who thought that the word hot was the name for the kitchen stove. The mother had said something like, "Don't touch that, it's hot," and the infant assumed that the word hot meant it's the stove, that was the name of the object. But that doesn't happen that often. When it does happen, obviously, the infant will use that word. It'll be obvious that it's wrong. That adult in its life will correct the infant, and life goes on. And infants aren't really stringent in the categories they're building. They're very flexible, very plastic. They're happy to accept an adult's correction, and they're happy to take statistics about the world around them. And as the statistics are updated in their language, then they update their categorization of the world as well. Another bias that they have is described on page 155. It's describing overextension and underextension. Underextension is a phenomenon when children only use a word to refer to more specific things than the word really was intended. So, for instance, let's go back to this example of dogs. If we use the word dog to point to a Dalmatian, we intend for the infant to learn that any kind of companion animal with a snout and wet nose and wagging tail and four legs is a dog. But the infant may, if it underextends, it may infer that the word dog refers only to that specific kind of dog that we're pointing out. For instance, a Dalmatian. Or if we I mean, even a more specific example of underextension might be that the infant believes the word dog refers to the name of one specific animal, just only my household pet. So they would not use the word dog to refer to any other dogs they might see, or maybe not even other Dalmatians. They might use the word dog to refer only to their specific pet that lives in their house. That's underextension. They don't use a word as often, as generally as they should. Overextension is when they use the word too much, too generally. That is to say, for instance, if we taught an infant the word dog, and they use that word to refer to any four-legged mammal. If they called a cat a dog, and they saw a cow and said dog, and they saw raccoon and said dog, then that would be overextension. They're using the word more liberally, more generally than they should. But the interesting thing that we found as researchers is, as we see on page 156, that infants are more likely to be biased toward underextension. The problem with that is it's hard to detect, because infants aren't using the word wrong. They're using it exactly as it should be, just less often than they should. So for instance, if your child learns the word dog, points to your family dog, says dog, then you think, oh, my infant knows the word dog, whoop whoop. But if the infant never points to another dog anywhere else you go and says the word dog, then this infant may be underextending the word dog and may not use it as appropriately as it should, maybe not using it as often as it should or generally as it should. And if that happens, it's difficult for us to see because the infant isn't using the word blatantly wrong. If the infant overextends, that's super easy to detect. The infant might point to a cow and say dog, and you can correct it and say, oh no, honey, that's not a dog, that's a cow. And pretty soon the infant learns what a dog is and what a dog isn't. But in the case of underextension, infants have to self-correct. They have to find some evidence. They have to hear an adult use the word over and over again to refer to many different kinds of dogs, and the infant will try to open up its category in his mind so that he will understand what a dog is and what a dog isn't, and he'll try to just self-correct and sort of adapt this category in his mind so that it means what he thinks it means. Then another bias that they have is that words matter and tones don't. This is a fascinating one because infants from the beginning, as we read in chapter 4, process, and adults too, process tones and speech sounds pretty similarly in the brain. They process tones in much the same statistical patterning ways that they process speech sounds, but from the very beginning, infants are biased to believe that words are important, that they might carry meaning, but that tones do not. This is demonstrated in an experiment when researchers present, like the switch task, present a picture and a word, and infants are able to learn that and to recognize that that word is associated with that picture. But if they present a picture and a tone, then infants don't associate that tone with that picture. They don't learn to predict that if they hear that tone, they should look for that picture, or they should know that that picture is going to be presented. So that suggests that infants are biased from early on to expect, just naturally, without really any input, they should expect. Sorry for the interruption there. This is to suggest that infants are biased from early on to think that words matter and that tones do not matter, that they don't carry meaning. A final bias that infants have is that they consider the shape of an object, the function of an object, the creator's intent of an object, not usually, though, the color of an object, when they're trying to make categories. So if they're trying to group together apples, they're going to consider how an apple looks, what an apple does, whether, if an apples aren't made, but if they were going to categorize beds, that we consider what the creator intended for this object. But that's a uniquely human trait. Dogs, for instance, only consider shape at first until they've had experience with that object, and then they consider only texture when they're trying to determine what objects fit inside of a category.